recruiting, departmental alliances, your day-to-day activity, skills training, sales enablement, two more.
Okay, I am so thrilled and honored to have Kelly Ford join us on our very first episode of Go-to-Market Excellence. Kelly is a general partner at Edison Partners, which is a growth stage equity investment firm in New Jersey. We're also lucky to have Kelly on our board at Scale Matters. Kelly, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. And I, in our pre-show call earlier, found out you're a Red Sox fan, and not like one of these post 2004 Red Sox fans, like a really real one. So, how did you become a Sox fan, and what was your first memory at Fenway Park? I'm super curious as a Sox fan myself.
My first memory. I grew up out in the Boston area, outside Boston, so, and my mom and dad both are from the city, and so it was just a thing. Like, I don't think we had a choice but to be Red Sox fans. But it was a great outing, great thing to do on a Saturday, or a weeknight, which was like the real treat, right, on like a school night or something. But always went with my dad and my brothers, and when we weren't there, we were, tracking Wade Boggs drama or Roger Clemens or
Move on.
Yeah, it was just like core to our family, and I think I was born a fan. It's interesting you said 2004 though, because that was actually the year I moved to New York City, which of course proudly wore my Red Sox cap everywhere. And the series that year, being a Red Sox fan in New York wasn't easy, but I was beaming about it, no doubt. And actually the year before that,
Heartbreak.
which was my last year in Boston, yeah, heartbreak, but it was interesting. I was actually, like, quick story. I went to Game 6 and we won, and I worked from home that day, and midday went to the gym, and the gym was in a hotel where the Yankees were staying. So there was a bunch of, team members like working out midday before Game 7 that evening. And I was stretching after my workout, and one of these guys who seemed a little older, and I knew I recognized him, but I wasn't quite sure who he was, like dressed in grays, the Yankees gear, started criticizing how I was stretching after my workout. He said, "I saw how you've been working out, and you're not stretching properly." And I'm like, "Who are you? Like, and why are you talking to me?" And I just let me get through my thing. And then he offers to stretch with me, and I say, "I'm like, who are you?" Right? And he says, you're with the Yankees? He's like, "Yeah, I'm with the organization, but, but no," and I'm cracking jokes about the game the night before and all this, and he's serious, and he's really not engaging, but he's very interested in making sure I'm stretching properly. And then finally I ask him again, like, "Who are you? You're kind of familiar." And he says, "I'm Reggie Jackson."
No. Oh
So even though, I had my Red Sox hat on, I was, thrilled because we won the game the night before, but then obviously that was a heartbreaking, but it was kind of cool to, stretch at the gym with Reggie Jackson.
Mr. October himself.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Funny. I think my first memory is going to the park, and I was a huge Nomar fan. This is late 90s, and Nomar, yeah. Just I got his autograph 2 days in a row right after he pulled. They used to have this kind of like where the players pulled in, it wasn't exactly walled off back then, and so you could wait
sure.
for the autographs, and you're fighting against older creepy people who were trying to get autographs and sell them on eBay. But I was able to get it 2 days in a row, and then I think my favorite memory though is I saw Pedro throw a shutout, and then but Big Papi hit a walk-off one game I was there.
Happy,
so it's just you can never forget it. So
it's the best.
It really is.
I think they have the best. I think they have the best. Still have the best record in baseball right now, right? This season,
pretty close. Yeah, if not the best. So yeah, it's looking like a good year.
Love it.
Absolutely. Well, we could talk about the Sox all day, but I'd love to get a little bit more into your story. I've heard bits and pieces of it over the years, but I'd love to hear how you kind of went from marketing executive to over to being on the VC side as a partner at Edison, because I think there's a lot of folks that are more so in my shoes in sales and marketing leadership who often one day dream of making the jump over, but it's obviously not easy. And love to know what you did to position yourself to go from in-house marketing leader to a VC.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a goal by any stretch, but somehow I feel like maybe my entire career happened to bring me to this spot. I was always very very focused on. I was sort of early in my career. I was in a role at Lotus and IBM before I got the whole startup bug and started doing, fast, high growth tech company stuff, earlier stage stuff. Where I always had a view sort of broadly across the organization, and in a way where I felt like I was reminded every day, or I was so overcommitted to the corporate initiatives and strategies and things that the company was trying to accomplish. And in a very large organization, that's very difficult. But the importance of alignment in a well-oiled machine at any stage of a business was just something that was very top of mind for me. So when I started working and doing startups, I was always focused on this alignment and how all the functions work together. And it didn't matter what my title was, what my level was. I was always sort of bridging and getting ahead of, communication breakdowns or misalignments or broken processes or whatever it is. And there's a potential for a lot of that when you're a high growth company and things are moving really fast. And if people aren't aligned, it gets in the way of acceleration. So I guess fast forward, through my various experiences, I had a lot of exposure to, fundraising and boards and M&A, and I kind of worked for a public company that went public pretty early, and all of those experiences were, as an operator, I was always very much, I always wanted to make sure I was aligned with the board. Like, we were aligned internally, but we're also aligned with the board and the investors and the whole thing. And then ultimately, I mean, Edison was an investor in one of my companies, and there was a lot of transformative initiatives going on in that business, and so there was a lot of board exposure. And then fast forward, I'd moved to the Princeton area and reconnected with Edison, and they had a vision. There was a founder transition going on and a new partnership, not new, but a new structure around a new strategy, moving away from venture capital and more toward a growth equity strategy. And that was 7 years ago, and they convinced me to join and help infuse more operating experience into how we evaluate, how we sell companies, how we evaluate companies, how we help our companies. And it seemed like a great fit. I also just never really held a job that anybody held before me, and that held a lot of appeal. Like, I had enough familiarity with the tech industry and the stage of companies where we invested, but I had never been an investor. So, so my operating experience and working in kind of pre-revenue to 100 million revenue companies, following my IBM days, was super relevant to Edison strategy, and was a great way to kind of get in and apply what I knew, and while learning from folks who have been investing for decades, or a decade or more. So it was, I joined more as an operating partner initially, and then evolved, started taking board seats and managing investments and leading investments myself. And I'm doing that now, and I still use my operating chops, working with our companies and kind of day to day at the firm, while also trying to be a great investor.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, and it sounds like one of the keys for you was before you even got into the marketing tactics and as a practitioner, it was a true understanding of business and really mastering the business and business alignment side of it, and then you layered in the marketing stuff, and then it was those two things together that kind of positioned you for a unique role that, like you said, nobody had ever held before. What kind of what would you say to somebody who maybe is in a marketing or a sales leadership role right now, and you could help them fast track their knowledge of things on the investment side? Like, is there any book or any course or anything that you would recommend? Maybe one or two things if they want to get over to the VC side someday.
Honestly, the good news is, like, if that's an interest, you should reach out to look around for which firms are investing in spaces that you like or where you have experience, and ask for the time. People do that with me all the time. I'll always give time like that. I also think if you've got strong operating experience in a sector and stage that's relevant to a particular investor, your operating experience is more relevant than it's ever been. Venture firms, growth equity firms, always PE firms had operators on their teams and have some sort of value add platform that, helps the companies. And Edison, for the size of fund and size of firm and stage where we invest, when I joined and we built out our whole operating platform, it was fairly differentiated. I still think it is for the stage where we invest and the size of our team and size of our funds. But now everybody has something that they offer portfolio companies, and that just creates that much more opportunity for operators who think they want to, come over to the investment side. But if you're working in a company, spend time with your board. Ask questions of your investors. Get time with them outside the boardroom, and educate yourself on what the opportunities might be. I always had a great relationship with my board and the investors, and I made sure of it just for learning and relationship purposes, and it made the board meetings a little less stressful when you felt like you knew the people around the table, you knew what their interests were and their hot
Sure.
buttons and all of that. So yeah, I mean, you just got to be curious and reach out and tap the right people to get a point of view to see if it would be something interesting. But there are plenty of timing's everything, and these jobs aren't widely available, and they're not typically advertised either. But starting to network and understand which firms have capabilities that you could plug into as an operator. There's more of those roles available than
Sure.
than
I
there was
love
10
I love
years
that
ago.
advice, because I think a lot of times, just from experience, you think if you're not the CEO, then you don't deal with the board, or like the CEO is the only one that accesses the board or communicates often. But it sounds like that doesn't have to be that way, and you don't have to think like that. And I mean, if you're an investor, if you have VC backing you, then they want the company to be successful. It doesn't matter, and they want to help all the leadership. I'm sure. Yeah,
100%. Yeah. And honestly, it's if a CEO is blocking that relationship, that's a problem. And the investors wouldn't want that, and the board wouldn't want that. But, you know, to be safe, checking in and communicating with your CEO, like, hey, I'd like to get to know the board more. I'd like to know what's on their minds. It'll help me be more effective in the boardroom, but I just have a personal, career interests or want to get educated. That's totally appropriate.
and you mentioned a minute ago that you're now leading several investments at Edison. What any portfolio companies you're especially excited about right now, and any noteworthy exits that you've been a part of in the past few years?
Well, I have an enterprise software background largely, and we invest in enterprise software companies at Edison. But I've actually, over the last year and a half or so, have been more focused on fintech investing and working with our fintech team. Um, Generally, and we've been, fintech investors for almost 20 years as a firm. Um, we've got, but across the portfolio, I mean, there's actually been a lot of really exciting things happening lately. I mean, Moneyline is one of our fintech companies who have, will soon be going public through a SPAC. Health Recovery Solutions in, our sort of home state of New Jersey. They're in Hoboken. It's a remote patient monitoring company. Just raised a $70 million round, and we partially exited. We invested and have joined LLR in they're leading that round. Similar dynamic with Terminus,
Sure.
which your audience might know. Account-based platform for marketing, sales, and customer success, or go-to-market platform generally now is that they were evolving into. They just raised a $90 million round. Similar to Health Recovery Solutions, we've been in there a little while. It was 2 funds ago when we invested. The company's been a rocket ship. It's doing extremely well.
Sure.
We're along for the ride for sure. Great Hill led that last round. We took partial exit and continue to, invest in that business. I guess one last one, I guess. I could keep going. There's a lot of really exciting things going on in the portfolio, but
Oh yeah.
Triple Lift was Vista, just their ad tech platform. Vista just invested, did a recap deal there, valuing the company at 1.4 billion. So we got a significant liquidity from that, which was exciting, but we also rolled some ownership, so we're still in there, and kind of similar dynamic. Triple Lift, Terminus, and Health Recovery Solutions, we're going for a second bite of the apple. So a lot of these larger private equity firms that kind of operate just above us have interest in our portfolio, and we partner with them, kind of go forward after they lead those rounds.
Were you involved with
That's
Bill
just a few. But yeah, Billtrust was Edison Fund 5 company. I was on the board for a couple years before exiting our position a few years ago, and then I remained on the board as an independent director, not dissimilar to my board position at Scale Matters. Just the company's a little bit greater scale. Until the company went public, I rolled off the board, and but that was the company is doing really well as a public company and growing nicely, and still really close with the business. So that was exciting to see. They were one of the earlier SPACs with all the SPAC craze going on, and having a successful
That's exciting. And
public
so
offering there.
we know when the teams win the NFL Super Bowl, they go to Disney. So take us behind the scenes at a VC firm or a private equity firm. So when one of your companies exits, I'm like imagining you're heading straight to Teterboro and you're on the next private jet to the Bahamas. But tell me, what's reality? How do you guys
No, not
celebrate?
quite. You know what? I think it's more about celebrating the CEOs and the management teams. I think it's less. I mean, we have a track record of, solid liquidity events. The money gets wired, we all high five each other, but no, it's more about seller. We give Superman capes to our CEOs at our annual meeting each year when there's been, a sizable exit, and we sort of thank them publicly in front of all of our customers, our limited partners there.
Sure.
But it's more about celebrating them and the management teams than ourselves, I guess.
That's awesome. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of celebrations coming based on the companies you just mentioned a few minutes ago. I want to get into the what we're going to discuss for the bulk of the conversation today. And, with your background and as, first in marketing and now as an executive and an advisor, literally there are dozens of topics we could go deep on. We could have a 3-hour Joe Rogan style interview, but I want to ask you specifically to talk about how you evaluate chief revenue officers. My CEO and your fellow board member Scott Stauffer, he always talks about how Kelly is way more involved and committed than the typical board member. She's super active, and that means that you get asked a lot to interview potential leadership candidates for your portfolio companies. So tell me about that process and specifically in regards to chief revenue officers, because it's kind of a newer role, especially at growth stage tech companies. And I guess just to start, what cues are you looking for when you're screening those candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first it's, I feel like it's a title that is kind of thrown around a little bit now. And we find ourselves finding ourselves asking the question like, oh, okay, so and so is, or we need a chief revenue officer, or please meet in a second meeting maybe, or in a diligence meeting, so and so our chief revenue officer, and it's like, okay, well, what's your span of control? Like, what's the scope of that role? So you can kind of look at it as functional in terms of what is a CRO ultimately supposed to be responsible for. Obviously, revenue, the word is in there, but it can take different shapes and in forms. I'd say functionally, a chief revenue officer has sales and success. And then you see variability around maybe sales development, partners, and channels. Channels should probably be under there. So, sales, channels, CS. And then sometimes sales development sits under marketing. Sometimes marketing sits under the chief revenue officer. Sometimes services is under the chief revenue officer, like service delivery, particularly when it's very closely tied to CS, customer success. So it can vary, but I would expect if someone has a CRO title, then they're not just running sales. And then the other way, to kind of look at is competencies. And I think that gets more to your question. And I have like 7 core kind of key competencies that I think about when I think about what does it take for a chief revenue officer to be effective? And then there's, sort of shades of each of those 7 areas around what makes someone kind of average versus someone who's like truly an A player and at the top of their CRO game. Let me see.
Yeah, and I think this would help to, I mean, I think you're going to help differentiate the difference between a high level, high performing VP of sales and what it takes to make the jump to CRO too. I mean, it all goes in hand
For
in hand,
sure.
right?
And I think the functional, so when you think about a VP of sales aspiring to be a CRO, that functional responsibility is really important because you could be a VP of sales with in I can run through some or all or some of these like kind of 7 core competencies, but you could be a VP of sales with a lot of strong skills in terms of supporting those 7 areas of core competency. But if you have not led, or you don't have in your responsibility, or your customer success or some of these other functions, then you're just a really senior seasoned sales leader, right? It doesn't make you a CRO. So I think the functional has to align, like, to justify the title truly, particularly these growth stage companies where I operate. But on the 7 competencies, I think about really in no particular order. I think I'll just rattle them off, but I think about recruiting. I think about cross organizational alliances and alignment. I think about, how are they spending their day-to-day activities, which is really around accountability and focused on carrying out the most critical corporate, initiatives, and the balance between, time in the field versus kind of a strategist role, and, someone who's average maybe might be a little more of a micromanager and spending 50 to 75% of their time in the field or with their reps, whereas what I would my expectation of a CRO, particularly at a growth stage company, would be a strategist that's spending like 25 to 30% of their time in the field and with their reps, and part of the balance of that time is also goes back to the departmental alliances stuff. So I think there's a balance of how time is spent, that can start to delineate between kind of A player and average, or even in some cases that competency as a VP of sales versus a CRO. I think being super focused on your team's strengths and weaknesses and keeping up with skills training, likewise sales enablement, being a leading and being a proponent and holding the rest of the organization accountable for keeping the sales team effective and productive and knowledgeable about products and latest solutions and how to position. I think also, so what is that, like 5? Let me see off the top of my head. Recruiting,
You got recruiting,
departmental
alignment.
alliances, your day-to-day activity, skills training, sales enablement, 2 more. Revenue strategy. So, what are segmentation, working with marketing, customer profitability, working with finance and customer success and support, making sure you've got a handle on the dynamics in the prospect and customer base, and aligning the organization around execution to make the number and make it in the most, effective and efficient way possible. And that leads itself to kind of the 7th point, which is really around processes and systems. So, if your revenue strategy has you going after, 2 segments of the market across 5 industry sectors, and, you're staffing accordingly, and you're your sales motion is different from one segment versus another, and the needs of enablement are differ from one sector to another, and how the number gets made in terms of velocity and volume and value for one segment versus another, like all of these dynamics that comprise the strategy that the CRO is holding, his or her peers, his team, and and holding everyone accountable for. You need the process, the systems, the access to the data and the insights to be able to support the strategy. So not being in the weeds, but setting a culture that is data focus, insight focus, and repeatability and predictability. Having a focus on repeatability and predictability. And you can't do that without really good process and discipline and standards and systems to support that. So being a tech optimist as a CRO, I think, is really important, even if it's one of your lieutenants or someone that reports to one of your lieutenants who the buck stops with in terms of some of the process and the system stuff. So that's a lot, but if you'd like if you want to pick a few that appeal to you, I'm happy to go into maybe a little more detail and clarify what some of these competencies mean, I guess.
Sure. So let's drill into a couple of these. You said under the third criteria, which was day-to-day activities. What are they spending their day-to-day time on? And then you mentioned a little bit later not getting in the weeds. So how could a CRO, how do you notice when they're getting this wrong, or how can you tell perhaps in an interview if someone's not the right fit because they're going to get in the weeds? Let's start with that.
Yeah, I mean, I often ask the question, how much time do you spend sort of in the field, so to speak, or with your reps and with prospects, open-ended? Mm-hmm. And someone says, I spend 75% of my time in the field. Well, this person is either you're in a really early stage, in an earlier stage company where that's required because the team's so lean, and everybody's wearing multiple hats. But in a growth stage where we are, that's not the role of a CRO in my view. And what you probably have there is just a really senior, seasoned sales rep who is maybe thrives in a wanting to be involved in a deal, or might be more heroics driven and kind of king of clothes type mentality, and there's risks there because when you're spending that much time, you've got a senior executive spending that much time putting out fires and mired in the details of deals. One, it's just not how a C-level executive should be spending the bulk of their time. It doesn't mean they're not in touch with what's going on with prospects and pipeline, but there's an appropriate time to introduce the CRO into a sales process. And if he or she is so engaged at that level, then they're really more of a glorified sales manager / rep. And
overtitled.
How are their reps going to learn and develop when they're doing their job for them all the time, right? Or when they're not allowing them to really do their job and do their things. So I think when the response is a high percentage, and many sales leaders are very proud of that, and it's stage appropriate, but that's not CRO day to day. I would say, kind of the somewhere in between is, okay, I spend 50% of my time in the field, but that profile might still have a little bit too much micromanagement of the sales process and the sales reps. And oftentimes, because you're spending so much time in the day-to-day of the pipeline in the field in deals, you can, you know, you can say all the right things, like you're carrying out the right corporate initiatives and working with your peers to execute and hit the number, but you can't really have a plan and keep your team aligned and connected and help the broader team execute against a plan when you're in there doing it yourself still, right?
Sure.
Even if there's a little bit less time. So, so I like, if I look at a resume, I like to say, how much time were you spending? And then it's, well, what were you spending your time doing when you weren't in the field? And even if it was an appropriate amount, like, oh, I spent 30% of the time with my time with customers and my reps and prospects. Okay, great. What are you doing the rest of the time? And hopefully it's, more strategy work and leadership for the organization and partnering work with other functions in the organization.
Yeah, you mentioned strategy work. I think you said it better be at least 30% of their time is spent on strategy. What do you see as the critical elements of the strategy that the CRO should own? You've interacted with a lot of CROs, current, past. You've hired a lot or been in the hiring process for a lot. The best ones, what are they spending that strategy time doing?
I think, it's interesting. Yesterday, as an example, we're in diligence with a company right now, and they're probably maybe 15 million revenue, growing nicely, and they hired a CRO like 75 days ago. And this guy's a stud. Like he's a legit CRO. And he came in, and, he had his first 90-day plan, and he's brought the organization along, and he focused on revenue strategy first, right? And this is where you should start. He's trying to understand who's the ideal customer profile, who are the most profitable customers, what are the sales cycle dynamics, the value, the ACV per customers, the unit economics associated with selling into one segment versus another, retention rates, all the, where do we draw the line from a segmentation perspective? What's the dynamic with partners? What are all of these things? He did a teardown. He offered his perspective, and he's now mapped out and refined in some areas, created new strategies in other areas, and then just full on optimization in yet other areas. And he took us through it yesterday, and I remember getting off that call thinking, I have so few of these calls. And it's because this CRO has marketing, sales, SDRs, success, and is holistic in his view of what revenue is and the impact on the organization, the reason he was brought in. And he's got like fairly senior lieutenants, maybe a more mature team than I would expect to see for a revenue stage that they're at, but they'll grow into it fast because they're growing nicely and they're raising capital. But I bring this up because he had fresh eyes on the business and was able to bring forth a comprehensive revenue strategy. And he did his own diligence on the business, understood what was there, what wasn't, what needed to be in place, not only to continue to grow and maybe accelerate that growth, but to scale that growth. And that was a true, strategist. And it's not, more often than not, if there's a CRO or a sales leader that we're talking to, there's somewhat of a strategy, but it's really nice for someone to be coming in fresh at the same time where we are, and to actually present a comprehensive plan because they just went through this exercise. And you would expect someone who's been on board a while and successfully leading a revenue organization in these companies to present something similar, like they'd have it in their back pocket, right? But I feel like folks who are in it a while can get so mired into details where, oh, okay, this is our segmentation, this is our ICP, and marketing really does most of this, but yeah, that seems right, and let's just execute. And that's the funny spot with this growth stage where, you know, you can see companies with mature go to market machines, and then you can also find folks where like sales is more mature than marketing, or marketing is more mature than sales. But anyway, I think the revenue strategy piece does need to come from the CRO, obviously aligned with the rest of the executive team, and the whole organization needs to be brought along and aligned with it. I think being very data and metric driven is really important to not only setting the strategy, but refining it and optimizing it over time. And it's a fluid thing. No, it's not a set it and forget it. You're constantly learning and evolving and adapting. And at the growth stage, you're also diversifying. It's not uncommon where we are putting our money in, to a company who's been blowing the doors off with as a core single product company, and now they're doing M&A, and they're building new products, and they're upselling and cross-selling in new ways, or they're diversifying channels or geographies. And you need a CRO, not that's sort of an indicator. It's one of the leading indicators of needing to step up your revenue leadership when you're starting to develop a more complex go-to-market approach, especially when you've got a big market to go after.
Yeah. Let's go back to the company that you were doing diligence on and the CRO there. You said, was your sense that most of the research and discovery he did about the company in order to build that 90-day plan was done during his interview process, or was it done in like the first 30 days, or some combination? And how would you recommend people who are coming in fresh into the role of CRO, how would you recommend them handle that? Do you think they try to do as much diligence before so that they can present that 90-day plan immediately, or do you think it's a post-hire issue?
Yeah, I mean, you can't get everything out of an interview process, but I mean, I usually, when we're evaluating CROs, or even a VP of sales, any executive for our companies, we usually have them present, as one of the final steps, like it's kind of if I were CRO of X company, what would I do? And part of that is what my first 30, 60, 90s looks like based on what you've learned during the interview process. So it's not going to be 100% the plan, but it's probably pretty close if they've asked the right questions and spent the right time, and if the CEO and the executive team and the board has spent the right kind of time with that candidate. So once they get in the business, I would say this CRO yesterday, he probably did, we weren't investors at the time when he joined a few months ago, but I'll bet he probably presented some sort of plan. And I also know that most CROs have a playbook, and he clearly has a playbook. And it's just his learning and adapting that playbook for the needs of this business versus his last company or his company before that. So I definitely got the feel that he has a method, and he's been successful with this playbook before. And but he's still learning, and there were questions he couldn't answer. about current state and how they're going to make the number this year. So I feel like I think the CEO probably said to him, focus on building what you need to build. We'll continue to shore up hitting this quarter's number, next quarter's number this year while you're building, we're building the plane while you're flying it type thing. So he was really focused on the go forward, and I think the CEO and the existing team is mostly focused on the near term.
That makes sense.
But yeah, I'll bet most of his plan was probably laid out as 30, 60, 90, and then he's just been tweaking it along the way.
I want to get into something you mentioned about processes, systems, and data and analytics chops in a second. And we'll wrap up with that. But before we do that, is your sense that the functions that should fall under a CRO are dependent on the type of product there, like fintech versus SaaS enterprise platform, or is it more about the team that is currently in place and what skills they have to own different functions? Like, how do you determine whether everything should roll up to CRO, or you should have a CMO, or you should have customer success or chief customer officer own post sale and those things? What are the dynamics that are considered there?
I mean, a lot of companies are designing around their people rather than taking a blank canvas and saying, what does the business really need? So that's kind of unavoidable in many cases, but most companies, I think, are, they realize, or maybe it's something the board sees and helps the CEO see when it's time to top grade a VP of sales or put someone above a VP of sales, or same thing with the VP of marketing and the need for a CMO. And it's just the business is evolving, and I think from a profile perspective, when it is a situation where you have a VP of sales and now it's time to bring in a CRO, you can write the spec and the scorecard and recruit for exactly the profile that you need. I don't know. I mean, we invest in, like, we have fintech companies that are more transactional models. We have companies across all our sectors that are marketplace models. So there's two-sided marketplace. You're acquiring demand and supply. I think in that case, both sides of a marketplace rolling up to a CRO makes sense. I think SaaS, it's a little more straightforward. The question is sometimes is the service delivery. How much of a services component is there in the business? And is it enough where you need a dedicated executive over service delivery? Or is that something, because it's a revenue item, that's part of maybe extension of success and under a CRO? I think it varies to make a decision functionally. If the VP of marketing has worked in 3 companies and successfully built and scaled an SDR function, by the time the CRO gets in the business, the CRO might want the SDR function, but if it's not broken, like, why are you taking it away from the VP of marketing and putting it under CRO? So that dynamic stuff happens all the time too. There's no perfect formula, but I do think when you can recruit the CRO with a very specific profile and the needs of the business fresh, that's a great way to approach it, even if you're making changes internally or promoting someone or what have you, to try to really step back from the person and say, what does the business really need? Rather than, oh, this person's great at 4 of these 7 things, and we'll just make do. Like, every business deserves a 7 of 7, right? In terms of those competencies for a CRO. You can get by, especially if the lieutenants maybe are strong in areas where the CRO is not, but, it can vary. But you should try to avoid hiring around the people. Like, you got to step back.
Every company deserves a 7-tool player, to use the baseball analogy.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up with the seventh of the 7 tools, or the framework that you use to evaluate CROs, and that has to do with processes and systems. So you're a VP of sales and you want to be a CRO. What are the metrics that a CRO needs to be aware of, that they need to be totally literate in, that a VP of sales may not even be thinking about yet or totally concerned with?
One thing I think about, well, a couple of things when it comes to process and systems. Is the person asking about pipeline and asking for a pipeline report, or do they just go into the CRM and see it there? Right? Like, if the CRO has, this is such a tactical, like, minutia example, but if the CRO has laid out the proper processes, disciplines, systems, and is holding the team accountable to it, then they don't need to ask somebody for what's going on in pipeline or how that rep is performing, or this one or that one, right? Like, you have this stuff at your fingertips. You also, as a CRO, if you've done your job correctly, aren't doing pipeline review meetings every week with your whole sales team. Like, that slot should be replaced with a deal strategy call for, like, the hottest, most valuable deal that you've got, or most competitive deal you have in the pipeline, with a subset of people who can actually act, like, have a strategy call and figure out what the game plan is to go win that deal, right? So, because you can't have a deal strategy call, or you can't, the deal strategy stuff doesn't exist in the CRM. But the pipeline insights and the reports and sales rep performance and territories and, all of these things, that's all in the CRM. So it's kind of it's just a different way of managing, because you've put the time in on the process and systems to help yourself as CRO have insights and visibility, but also make sure you're using the team's time effectively, because if you're just looking at reports and data, it's all in the system. But if you're really trying to move a ball forward, you could use that pipeline call time for figuring out how you're going to win the biggest deal in your pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
It does. And
does that make sense?
Among other strategic things they could be focused on, if they have CS or marketing under their purview as well. But yeah, so VP of sales to CRO, does the typical CRO, or not a typical, does a great CRO understand SaaS metrics or the fintech metrics and that stuff absolutely cold? And is that something that you feel VP of sales to get to CRO needs to spend more time on? Yeah, I guess I'm trying to get at, like, what are the
Yeah, I would say the difference. I would say that if a CRO is executing on strategic initiatives and key processes and setting that direction, mobilizing the team around it, and everything has metrics associated with it. So in order to measure it, you got to get the right process and systems in place to measure the success of any given initiative. Is it a win back, initiative that you've got going? Is it customers that look like this? We have this new product to sell. We want to expand 100 accounts in 60 days. How are we going to do that? Well, you need, what are the quantitative goals? How are we measuring and tracking and prioritizing, mobilizing the team around it? I would say, a less effective approach to a similar initiative would would be lighter on the metrics and be all about the execution and the heroics and okay, we're going to do this, go, but not really have the house in order. And then when it's time to report on it, it's lighter metrics, it's more anecdotal. Oh, okay, this week, you know, these three customers bought the new product or were in contract, but okay, well, what does the rest of that pipeline look like, and how many are we going to close next week? Or and it tends to be a little more storytelling and anecdotal because and there's some metrics, but because there isn't enough rigor on the discipline around using the systems or discipline on process for any of these initiatives, you're not going to get a comprehensive view. The CRM, you know, it's not that every VP of sales is like this, but and it's not the difference of like the average sales leader versus the excellent sales leader. But if you're a VP of sales who's not applying that rigor for your sales team, how are you going to take on success and maybe marketing and the overall go to market machine if you haven't really put that in place for your core of what you were leading before the potential of a promotion? So each of those functions needs to be looked at in that way. And by the way, like whether it's win back or an upsell campaign, everybody's engaged in that anyway. It's not just sales, it's marketing, it's sales, it's success. So I think the rigor, I mean, I've worked in organizations where it's like the last conversation the sales leader had and sharing anecdotes and using that as the data points rather than like what's really going on, because nobody's held accountable to the process and they aren't using the systems appropriately. And then the CRM becomes this like activity tool and it's just a slog and nobody really
What
wants to
percentage
use it.
what percentage of companies do you see where the CRM is just a value detractor instead of a useful tool?
I'd say I'd say probably 50%.
Yeah. I mean, that's huge. And so what you're saying is that the CRO needs to own that, and he needs to own the revenue operations function, and that's just as key
And it is
as
revenue ops. It's not just sales ops, right? Like you can't
yeah, that's right.
look at sales pipeline and commissions in a silo. It really does need to bring in,
That's right.
because marketing's engagement isn't just top of funnel anymore or generating leads. It's engagement throughout the entire, buyer and customer journey. So revenue ops really does need to factor that engagement, and then once someone's a customer, it's that engagement continues, and the notion of health and retention and expansion. So the CRO's thinking about all of that, so the revenue operations function needs to as well. And I think similar to the CRO title issue, a lot of organizations are now using the term revenue ops, but it's really just sales ops, and they're not really folding in marketing and CS the way they should.
Yeah, that probably bugs you as an alignment person.
Yeah,
That
it
the
does.
marketing ops and sales ops are separate.
Yeah,
What's the deal with that?
I'm a lunatic on the go-to-market alignment.
All right, so if there's one thing that Kelly Ford wants every CRO to know about how they can be successful and run a successful revenue team today, what is it?
Well, let's go back to the revenue ops thing. Like, if you're a true CRO, you've got multiple go-to-market functions and disciplines, processes, metrics under you. So you don't need sales ops, marketing ops, customer success ops. It's revenue ops, and it should be as end to end as the scope of your roles and responsibilities. So I'll lean on that one. There's probably some others, but
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I love it.